Are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
We don't have to feel so alone because we're not. I think there are more of us that are able to do more than we think.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very Asian American Pacific Islander, the ways in which that I've been brought up or culturally or whatever expectations, the ideas that we can't speak up, as an immigrant, you need to just blend in. Some of those things don't serve us now. Those things are really have kept me from speaking up and maybe walking into everything God has called me to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a message that isn't even necessarily just for Asian American Pacific Islanders. There are people who in our movement just need to hear that whatever ways in which we've been brought up or our experiences, how quickly we sometimes disqualify ourselves because of those things.
Yep.
It doesn't need to be that way, but there's more. I'm just really excited for the work of the association. It's a deeper level of coming home and feeling like we're home in the vineyard.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. May is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and in celebration, we will be hearing from some of the leaders of our AAPI Association. In today's episode, our host Jay Pathick talks with Marianne Della Torre, Senior Associate Pastor at North Jersey Vineyard. Let's listen in.
Well, thank you for joining us for our podcast. Have you been
happy to be here?
But you've been listening to this, so we just talked about it. So you're ready to go. You know all about it. You're super excited to be on this.
Yes, so very excited.
Or nervous,
excited.
Or whatever.
I
Any
won't
number
think about that part.
Okay, good. I'm glad. I'm so glad. We should start where it all starts, which is where you were born and grew up. And I like your name. I was looking at this as I was thinking about it. I was praying a little bit about our time. Mary Ann. So it's always Mary Ann. It's not Mary or Ann.
Yes.
Okay.
And it gets confusing because it's two words and there's a space in between.
Yeah.
And so, when I first came to this country, the notion of middle names was new to me. And so a lot of times my full first name would become split. And so to this day, some people will just assume my name is just Mary, but it's Mary Ann.
It's Mary Ann, separate, not hyphenated, not one word.
Yes. Yeah.
And then your last name is
Della Torre.
But also separated.
Yes. There's so many spaces between. It's like the longest name ever.
Right. So it's actually 5 separate words. Mary Ann de la Torre. 5 words. So anybody would see that, would try to figure out nationality, backgrounds,
right,
how you're married, so there's just in looking at your name, there's a couple stories there, is my hunch.
Totally.
Okay. So I only start there to say, I was thinking about it and I thought, man, it'll be interesting to break down how that all comes into being. But start with where you're born and you grow up, and I bet we're going to get to the naming.
Sure. Yeah. So I was born on a couch in the Philippines. That's where my story begins. Funnily enough, my mom was a nurse and she didn't trust the hospitals in the Philippines. So she opted for the midwife option.
As a nurse.
Which is how, yes. So just a little clue into how things were around that time in the Philippines. But so I was born in the Philippines. I grew up in Metro Manila, which is a kind of suburb. It's a city suburban type of situation, and surrounded by lots of extended family. So I lived at the time with my great grandmother. My mom is one of 7 she's the eldest. So lots of aunts and uncles. So those first formative years in the Philippines were just always filled with just warm memories of family.
Just all the family. That's a lot of family.
A lot of family.
Yeah. Of 7, great grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
So what did your dad do? What was his life like? She's a nurse.
Yeah, my mom was a nurse. My dad worked in agriculture.
Okay.
In the Philippines. So the way he would describe it was he would I think he inspected rice fields or something to that extent.
Okay.
Would travel around different parts of the Philippines and things like that. So,
interesting.
Yeah. And then 3 years after that, my brother was born on the same spot.
Wow.
And
well, it worked out.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And then soon after my brother was born, my mom left first to kind of start to establish a home for us in New Jersey. And then my dad soon followed. And so my brother and I were without our parents for probably about 3 years.
So wait, back up, because this is something that probably most people wouldn't get their head all the way around.
Yeah.
So your mom and your dad is it because they have a dream? Like, wouldn't it be amazing to live in the U.S. someday? But you have all this family around.
Right.
In Manila. So that's a big choice. I mean, does it feel like your family's all going, this is great, take the opportunity? Or does it feel like a big shift? Like, wow, you guys are leaving. That's huge. Or how does that?
I think at the time it was what was expected.
So take whatever opportunity you can. Right.
And the story was that my grandmother, who was kind of the matriarch of our family, was very, she had plans for my mom. And her plans for my mom did not involve getting married when she did. And so this was kind of, because she had married my dad, this was my grandmother's deferred plan for my mom, was to get my mom into America and then start petitioning all of her other brothers and sisters so that eventually all of the siblings would then be living in America for better opportunities. Politically, in the Philippines, the 80s were not that awesome.
Right.
It was the Marcos era. So I have memories of even going to marches and protests, and because it was very scary for anyone who disagreed with him. Right. And so that was all in play too. And I think just general immigration, there was a shortage of nurses in America all throughout that time, 70s into. So many Filipinos, that was their way into America, was to become a nurse and to be placed in a hospital that needed nurses. And that's kind of what everyone was doing in the Philippines.
So it was all part of the larger strategy of, let's go with the oldest or close to the oldest son or daughter, try to get them into a skill that would make them most marketable to be in the United States, try to get a foothold with them, then bring the spouse, then the kids, or sometimes the siblings first, then the kids.
Right.
One by one, we can get everybody in the U.S. over a decade or whatever. If we stick to the plan, we get it all going. And that's a fairly common story for a lot of people. Like, if people don't know that that's a common story, that's definitely my dad, my family, that was the plan. My dad got there and then slowly brought every sibling over one by one, either through different kinds of work opportunities or through academic visas, depending on what they were able to do.
Right.
And all the money that gets earned by my dad is being set aside to pay for everything, their ability to start in housing and education. And so, there's a decent amount of folks that this is the story of immigration. And it's interesting. So in the Philippines, it was mostly nursing. That's an interesting, they just found a door. Like, hey, we can do this. And so then were they just coming solely under a work visa, or was there an asylum thing given all the unrest of what's going on?
It was mostly just the work visa.
Interesting.
From what I understand. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so in that then, it was easier to bring Dad first and then you guys a few years later.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And I think they had to weigh, because I think my dad had an agriculture degree. My mom was placed solely like a half hour from New York City.
Right.
What was he going to do with his degree?
Right.
And so with the money my mom was making, and it was probably my mom was the sole breadwinner for a while because my dad didn't. Funnily enough, my dad did become a nurse eventually.
Interesting.
Yes. But in those years, it was just my mom who was making money. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, their decision was, well, we would be able to earn more. And if we just kind of left my brother and I in the Philippines taken care of by extended family. And so that's what they did. And it took 3 years. By then, I had another brother in America who was born in New Jersey. So there's two of us that I have three siblings total. Two of us are born in the Philippines. Two of us are born here.
Wow. And because then how old are you by the time you move?
So I was almost 7.
7. Okay. So
1988. Yep.
Yes. You're old enough to remember what it felt like. And, man, I'm on this plane and I show up in this totally strange place. And all the cultural acquisition stuff is full on.
Yep. And I remember even in the Philippines, that was always the plan. I knew that from the beginning, you are going to eventually move to America.
Right.
And so they were trying to teach us English and things like that. And so my aunt, I remember it was so painful because even before I knew what I was reading in English, they made me read out loud in English. And so I had to read these words in this book that I had no idea what anything meant. But I mean, I know eventually it did help me out in terms of learning English more quickly. But those were just some of the things like that we kind of just experienced. And speaking with other, Filipinos, we just have those similar stories of, how do we prepare to move halfway across the globe and getting acclimated to the culture. And so it was an interesting time, but I'm so glad I had those few years in the Philippines too. I had a good amount. I think I had like 2 to 3 years in school there. And they did teach a good amount of English in the schools in the Philippines. So I wasn't completely without any sort of English skills coming into America. But it's just interesting to think about that time in my life. I remember landing in JFK and just being in awe of all the, getting on the highway and looking at all the different trees, how different the trees looked. And, just the first snow in New Jersey was just this amazing, beautiful experience, and nothing like the cartoons I would watch in the Philippines, things like that.
It's so wild to think about that stuff and to think about, because now with having kids and you think about you being those ages and what you were going through and how you process those kinds of things. Yeah. That's amazing. And it really does put in front of folks, again, so many folks have been just raised in the U.S., not always having a framework for what a golden ticket coming to the U.S. is for so much of the world. Like how it is like the target on the board, like for a whole family. Like if we could just get one person in the States, just one, it's a doorway to pull our whole family. So it's trying to figure out which kid is the most academic, or which kid could get the right kind of work. Or it's amazing to think about that and how many Americans are unaware of that. I mean,
right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole generation of Filipino women and men who have just gone into nursing because this is the ticket, this is the way.
Yep.
So many of my peers, all of their parents, dads included, are nurses. It's a thing in the Filipino community. Like,
totally. Well, and then there's other ethnicities that have all the other little jokes associated with them, or stereotypes that are stereotypes because they're fairly accurate. You know, like there are folks, again, like usually Southern Indians, you know, being Indian, that it's convenience stores or liquor stores. And there was a certain niche they kind of just found, like, okay, we can run this thing within this corporation or within this franchise system, or a nail salon, or, you know, any number of things that different ethnicities, maybe just through relationships, through family connections, just went, well, here's a thing we can do. You know, here's a kind of business we know how to run. Here's a type of industry we know that helps us get a visa, or. And it's just, I think, again, as I talk to so many of my American friends, they don't often recognize how that's like a strategic, intentional, like, thing your whole family's banking on.
Right.
And then, of course, the next investment is in your kids. So then it's, if we can get a foothold and then you can get a great degree, if you can become a doctor, if you can become a lawyer, if you can build a business, if you can be an engineer, now we're flying. Now our whole next set of generation has every opportunity in this new world in the U.S., which, again, leads towards all the stereotypes of like why, you know, my daughter's in her school and the Indian kids work the hardest at math and they're always taking the extra classes through the summer or whatever. And that isn't just, oh, they're trying to be smart. There's a mentality. There's like a framework of we're building a world. We're building a life. We're accelerating a pipeline that there was probably previous generations who came from Europe that was, again, sort of the frame as immigrants. But it's just, it's amazing how consistent the story is, you know, across different folks. If you meet them and they're of a certain age, they came in maybe through a certain doorway, whether it was in the 80s or another window in the late 60s, that's kind of what's happening. That's the sort of generational story. And so for you, as you're doing that, how much or is church or spiritual life, is that anywhere in the mix as you're growing up in the middle of this?
Oh, yeah. So going back to my grandmother, she was the first one. I mean, the Philippines is predominantly Roman Catholic.
Right.
It was a Spanish colony for hundreds of years. So that makes it strange in that we're in Asia, but it's a predominantly Christian country.
Yes.
However, everyone is Roman Catholic. So right around after World War II, there were missionaries from Ohio that came to visit my grandmother's town, and she was in her 20s at the time. They preached the gospel to her. She accepted Jesus, and she was the first one in our whole entire family that had this life-giving relationship with Jesus. Like her husband, I have to tell this story. My grandfather remained Roman Catholic for his whole entire life. Meanwhile, my grandmother did all the things. She was a pretty savvy businesswoman, so she had a plot of land and she helped build the first like Baptist church in my mom's town. She just invested so much in the church, and one by one, all of my aunts and my uncles then came into relationship with Jesus through her efforts. But this whole time, my grandfather still did not. And so 65 years after the fact that my grandmother said yes to Jesus, her husband finally said yes.
Wow.
And it was like about 3 months before he passed away. But the celebration in our family was just amazing. And so one of my cousins was actually in the Philippines at the time, who he himself is a pastor out in California, and he had the opportunity to baptize my grandfather in the ocean.
Wow.
Yeah. So we were basically praying for my grandfather for 65 years.
Wow.
Not me personally. I'm not 65 years old, but you know
Right.
what I mean? So yeah, I just give so much. I'm just so thankful for the faithfulness of my grandmother.
Yeah.
And so as a little girl, it was a fundamental Baptist church. We would go to this church Sunday after Sunday. I think I was one of the few kids in the church. It was a smaller church. Torre was a thing. And so they made me sing a lot. I'm not a singer, but they made me sing anyway.
That's so good.
And so I would always be around church, but that was my experience in the Philippines. Church was always something that we did as a family. You know, my Lolo, my grandfather didn't, but all of us do. And so when I moved to America, my mom and dad had been attending a fundamental Filipino Baptist church.
Fundamental.
So we were going,
wait, say those words again.
Lot of
fundamental Filipino Baptist church. So,
yes.
Okay, I love it. Okay, got it.
And so very conservative, everything that went along with that.
Sure.
We were there for a few years. And then through some family friends, and that church was a little bit further from us, there was a new church that was closer to us that was Southern Baptist Filipino. And so that's the church I grew up in.
Amazing.
Spent basically, from the time I was a child all the way through 18, when I left for college, took a break for college, and then returned there after the fact. And so I think throughout those years, I think the Lord was just so great in getting me in contact with the Word. I mean, the Word was just emphasized. We were reading our Bibles every day, praying. I was kind of one of the older ones. And so in our church at the time, so we formed kind of the first youth group in the mid to late 90s. And so that was an interesting time with like His Dating Goodbye and True Love Waits and all the Wow Worship things.
Yeah.
And, it's debatable whether everything was great or not.
Right.
And I have some hangups about that time period.
Sure.
And Christianity and the kind of evangelicalism in that time. But ultimately, it was the fact that I was being led by my youth leader who, she pastored me, but they wouldn't ever call her a pastor. But my youth leader, her name's Liz, she pastored me through those years. And what I really appreciated was that she also was an immigrant and grew up in America. And so she could kind of be the bridge between just the complexity of trying to live in a way that my parents expected, but in a whole separate context than that they're raising us in northern urban New Jersey.
Yeah. So let's talk about that, because you've alluded to that in more than one way. But I'm curious, because it's not true for every family that immigrates. But for your family, they went, and I'm not making a statement about it, I'm just observing. They went from one type of Filipino Baptist church to another Filipino Baptist church. So for your parents, was most of their sort of social life with Filipinos?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So they might go to work in the hospital, which is probably a diverse group of folks. But by and large, their, friendships, weekends, evenings, folks that come to the house, people's houses they go to, are by and large majority Filipino folks that probably inhabit some version of their story. So either had come over or first or second generation, but all of sort of a similar type of person that are also Christians by and large.
Yes.
And so that's their world. So they're raising you in that world in one sense, but then they're sending you to school.
Mm-hmm.
And how much of your school was Filipino, or were you in the public school? So now you're just sort of in the mix of everybody.
Yes. So for elementary school, I was in a public school, and where I was in New Jersey, I was in a fairly large city.
Mm-hmm.
And so my elementary school experience was a mostly immigrant community that I grew up in.
Interesting. Okay.
And so...
And immigrants from everywhere.
Yes. Very diverse.
Interesting.
Predominantly Hispanic where I grew up.
Yep.
But I had friends from all over the world. And I always tell people, growing up where I did, I knew in my mind that I was a minority. I knew what it meant.
Right.
I didn't feel like one until later on in life. And so for me, that was America. That was all I knew.
Yeah.
And so most of my friends had either just immigrated themselves from another country or their parents did. And so the conversations around what do you guys eat, or what's it like for you to try not to upset your parents by your choices.
Right. Or listen to this or that music, or can I go to this or that party, or can I even play sports if it's interacts with XYZ religious ceremony if you're Muslim, or can I date, quote unquote, even hang out with and be friends with people of the opposite sex if they're not within our same ethnic background. All of those things are live, dynamic conversations. If you're around
what language do you speak at home? I mean, there were at my schools, it wasn't even just Spanish. There were Polish and Filipino and Chinese and I mean, I grew up being surrounded by so many different languages. And so I realize now how truly unique that was. And I'm thankful for having had that experience. And I still do, actually, because I'm not too far from where I grew up. So
I was going to say, how far away are you from where you grew up?
15 minutes.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So you really do see all that. And you still have a life-giving life with Jesus. You're in this youth group. You're in this church that's great. But it is still sort of monocultural in one sense.
Yes. My church life was very monocultural.
That's so fascinating.
Once in a while, I'd get kind of in the high school years, we'd have these youth group events, and I'd be able to convince some of my friends to join me. But for the most part, it was a Filipino. My Christian life was a Filipino experience.
So great. And listen, what's so interesting, there's so much to talk about with that. And people have written, of course, volumes and volumes of books about these things. So we can't cover all of it, but the dynamics around that are so interesting for people observing from the outside, like how that shapes your faith and your understanding of the world. How much of faith and ethnicity and family are interconnected.
Right.
Like, so for so many classically Americans, if they've not been in some of those different overlapping worlds, your faith can be really independent from your ethnic thinking or your friendships or, they're all just sort of different categories. So, I play basketball and I hang out with whatever group of kids and I have this other kind of faith. And they're all independent. None of those things necessarily touch each other.
Right.
But for you, your family, your ethnic engagement, and your sort of religious understanding all form a thing together. And that's fascinating to think about, because obviously what I'm really curious about is how then when you go to college, I'm sure it changes a bit. That's usually when the shift happens. And then obviously you're in the vineyard, you're doing vineyard things. So some things began to change between here and there. Because so tell me, when was the first time you were like in a non-completely Filipino kind of Christian set of experiences?
I want to say it was in college.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going to a very small Christian school in Western Pennsylvania. And I fell in love with the campus. I think it was just so beautiful and clean. And where I was from was not that.
Right.
And so I was like, oh, I want to go here. And it's a Christian school, and I'm sure I'm going to grow in my faith. And it's well recommended by some folks. So let me, and thankfully I got in, but it was 98% Caucasian. And I had no idea.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That is
no, it's okay.
And you just roll into this like you've been in this, like Filipino church experience, your family, kind of ethnic diversity, immigrant families all around you, all these languages, and you just roll into Western PA in a small college. Wow. I mean, yes. That had to be a shock.
It was a complete culture shock. Yes, it was quite difficult at some points. And I think that was the first time I experienced being anywhere with that many white people, to be frank, That's kind of just how it went.
No, I believe you. No, I mean, it all adds up. It's like, yeah, I can see. And then all of a sudden you're like, I guess this is like my real life. Like, this isn't like a 30-second investment. This is my actual life now. So
right.
What does that mean? How do I live in this?
Yes. And so I think the realizations for me came slowly. I think the initial excitement of just being away from home. Yeah,
and you're in college, right?
Yeah. As fun and crazy as a Christian college can get, that was exciting to an extent. But I think how I describe it is it was the first time I felt like I stood out and disappeared at the same time. And over time, it became more painful and something that caused anger in me, because I think there was a different way people approached me or just didn't approach me at all.
Yeah.
And so that was tough. And I was in college when 9/11 happened. And so I remember vividly coming into the cafeteria, the TVs were on, we were set to go to chapel. Chapel was all about 9/11. At that point, I think we just ended up praying. But over the course of the next few months, as information about, the Muslim extremists in the Philippines came out, I remember sitting in a class. It was a geography class, and we were talking about globalization and, the exchange between countries and what that does. And I was sitting in the back. And so the teacher probably didn't even realize I was Filipino, but she chose Philippines as the example. And so she was like, okay, so what do we get from the Philippines and what do they then give us in America? And a few guys in the back just like were laughing and chuckling, and they said, terrorists.
Oof.
And I was just floored. I didn't know what to say in that moment. That was the first time I kind of heard anything so specific to my people, to who I am. And so that's just an instance of kind of some of the things that I heard, not directed at me necessarily, but towards other groups. And I did have enough courage to tell the teacher, to tell the professor, listen, this is what I heard. And they probably had no idea I was sitting right there. But if you could just please address this, or, I didn't even know what exactly I told her, but she did end up addressing it in the next class, which I was thankful for. But I think my time there did give me a sense of, ouch, like this, we have to do something about this. And I was an education major. And so I was just thinking about kids who are growing up different from everyone else.
Yeah.
And, those comments hurt, and they're very formative for anyone, let alone children. And so, I think that's when kind of the thoughts around inequity and how deeply these experiences that we have with people who are different from us, how necessary they are.
Yeah. Well, and so you said something interesting. I think it's a good phrase. You said, I feel like I disappeared and stood out at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So in what sense did you feel like you disappeared, and in what sense did you feel like you stood out?
I think in terms of, like, I was pretty much always an extrovert. Like I'm a friendly person. And I think when I felt like I was disappearing was when I felt like in every kind of interaction or conversation or whatever situation I was at, I always had to be the one to approach people. And soon enough, based on comments I heard, I think people assumed that things about me because I look different. So I think there were some people that didn't know if I could even speak English, or there were people that I had met in college who had really just no experience with people who were different from them.
Right.
And so, of course, anything that's new can be scary and fearful. And so I'm sure that's some people from maybe talking to me, but it was more difficult for me to make friends in some ways.
Right.
And so that's a way in which I felt like I disappeared. Like I had to always be the one to say, hey, you're in my class, or
right,
whatever, to make those connections. Connecting with people was tougher for me in that environment, for sure.
Yeah, because you feel a bit of the distance. People aren't sure, is this okay? And then the other way around, like, we tend to reflect what we experience. So this seems awkward. I'm not really sure. Maybe I'll just hang out. Or it feels like it's up to me. I have to bridge these gaps, like myself. And so as you're in that environment, you're going to church or chapel, you're in some kind of college expression. And were those things similar enough? I mean, because it depends on whatever kind of church you were in. Were they similar enough to your Filipino church, or was it completely different? Was it like, oh yeah, these are similar kinds of things, like worship or sermons?
Yeah.
Or, it was all like, yeah, this is similar. Or was it like, no, this is pretty different, given the sort of ethnic expression?
I think it was similar enough in that God really did use that time to strengthen my faith. And it was similar to the Baptist in me.
Right, right.
It was very similar to that expression of American Christianity.
Right.
That was very familiar to me. But in terms of feeling like I stood out, it's entering those sanctuaries, it's entering those classrooms, it's entering like the cafeteria.
Right.
And feeling like I'm the only person of color here.
Right.
So it was similar enough in that extent. And I did there were different fellowships at college, different Bible studies I was a part of. My close friends were very instrumental in just helping me in my faith, and God just used that time to really solidly, without kind of distraction, it really helped me to lean on Him, because I think there were times where I was just lonely, and despite having friends and thriving in certain aspects, there was still this like loneliness, because that part of me that wanted to engage with people in terms of like culturally, it wasn't there so much, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It does. And so then you finish college and go back home to Jersey.
Yes.
And you go back, you said, I kind of go back to the church I'd been in. So you're kind of in that church. And did you get a job teaching? Did you just start right in? Okay, cool. So now you're into teaching.
Yes.
Which is cool. And then how and in what way do you start to move toward this thing called the Vineyard? How does that enter into the story?
So, I was in a relationship with someone and we broke up, and I was in this devastated place of, I had already told my pastor at the Filipino church, I think this guy and I are going to work out. We're going to look for churches together. And so in that time period, and he wasn't Filipino. And so we were definitely looking at churches that weren't just Filipino.
Right. So you're already in that mode. Right.
Yes. Yes. So Vineyard happened to be one of them.
Okay.
And so after the breakup, I just went by myself and stayed. And I think for the first 3 months, I would just sit in the back and cry and cry and cry and cry. But that was such a healing time for me, and eventually got plugged into a life group at our church and learned so much more about the Holy Spirit was not taught to me at all.
Right.
Interacting with God at such an intimate level was not something I had experienced before the Vineyard. So those months were just I felt like I had put God in this box, and coming to the Vineyard just completely blew that wide open.
Right.
And so that was a beautiful time, and also kind of like had me really asking myself, is this okay? Like, is it okay for people to see pictures and does he, so it was a really good time to even in my personal faith, explore that for myself and really learn and grow. And so I had gotten plugged into a life group, and I loved where I was teaching. I had a heart for inner city just because that's kind of what I grew up in. I felt like I had my dream job in teaching in Jersey. I loved that school, loved those kids, but I had a really tough school year. And I remember at the end of that was the first time ever I had ever thought, wow, am I supposed to be doing this? Because I had felt like God really answered my prayer in providing that job for me. And so I remember praying very specifically. I said, God, if, this doesn't feel right now, if there's something else you want me to be doing, you got to let me know. And then 3 days after that, maybe, I think it was about 3 days, someone from NJB, one of the former pastors, was like, hey, we're thinking about possibly hiring a part-time or full-time children's ministry director. Would you be interested in applying? And I was like, whoa, okay, got it. I think you want me to at least like explore this a little bit and talk to the pastors and apply and talk to Phil and our executive pastor at the time. And I was just sold on the vision. I had never, ever growing up in the churches that I did, think it was a possibility to have a full-time ministry position as a woman.
Right.
And so that was kind of it. That was 15 years ago.
For the 6 weeks leading up to Pentecost Sunday with a break for Mother's Day, we're sharing stories that highlight the movement of the Holy Spirit among us. This is part of the Empowered series that vineyards all over the U.S. are participating in. For more information on this series, check out vineyardusa.org/Pentecost2023 and share your stories on social media using the hashtag VUSAEmpowered. We can't wait to see what the Holy Spirit does during this time. Registration is now open for our 2023 National Conference, Making All Things New. This year's focus is on evangelism, church planning, and global missions, and we're gathering in the beautiful Black Mountain, North Carolina, right outside of Asheville. There's special programming for kids and youth, so bring the whole family. Early bird pricing is available until May 31st, so register today. Link is in the show notes.
I got a couple of questions because there's a few things you asked that I'm curious about. And of course, you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. But so first of all, how did your folks do with you being like, I'm going to go check out other churches? I mean, that's like kind of a departure from the world we built you in, number one. And then number two, without making assumptions, are you living at home during this time? Like, I assume, because again, this is a thing that is usually true in immigrant families, is you're home usually until you get married. But so both of those create a different kind of tension. If you're at home and you've gone to another church, now you're starting to segment some of those things that were all put together at one point. So are those things true, or how did that work?
Yes. So when I told my dad, I think I'm going to be leaving our church, that was the first and only time he ever called a family meeting.
Oh, so see, there you go. There it is, right.
We all sat around the table and we talked about it. And I think they heard me out, miraculously enough. And so that was, but it did, I mean, it was that big of a deal that was the first, and that was the only ever family meeting.
Isn't that amazing? That's amazing.
It shook their world. You know, it was the expectation was that we would all be at church together forever and ever.
Forever, right?
Yes. Yes.
Well, and I doubt anyone at the Vineyard realized those stakes. I mean, maybe they did. But I think about most pastors. You have like this person who's been hanging around. Now they're in a life group and they say something to you like, you know, I've decided to make this my own church. And as a pastor, you're like, that's great. You know, like you aren't aware that like there's been a family meeting about this. I mean, that's a big deal.
And for me internally, walking into a church by myself it wasn't Filipino,
right,
was one of the scariest things I've ever done.
Right.
And so there is a lot that goes into the leaving, you know, because you're not just leaving a church, because what happens in these immigrant communities is it's not just your church, it's all of your friends, it's who you hang out with on the weekends, it's birthdays and parties, and it's everything is there. And so for my parents, now I understand where they're coming from, because I'm sure they saw it as a form of like, I'm walking away from them.
Distance. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so
were you living at home?
I was living actually, no.
Not
I
by
had
then.
just left home.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It was, and so yes, the conversation for my parents was like, well, is the church going to be able to pay you?
I love
and
this.
for me, it was like, also, I mean, that was a concern because
Right.
my first teaching job was at a Christian school.
Mm.
And the mentality was basically that it's, whatever is attached to ministry jobs, you're not going to get paid a lot. And I think I got paid $24,000.
Wow.
You can't live in North Jersey on $24,000 a year.
No.
So so that was 2 years. And then I then got a job at a public school. Yeah, it was, there were a lot of interesting conversations with my parents around this time in my life. I wasn't married yet.
Right.
So that came a few years after, but yeah.
It's a big deal. And again, like the only reason I'm breaking it down like that is it's possible that you're sort of just normal white vineyard pastor who's been leading doesn't quite recognize what's happening when someone walks into your church who is from a different ethnic background.
Right.
That they're not just voting on, sometimes these conversations get boiled down to worship style. Like, can you have worship that transcends an ethnic barrier, or are there people on the stage that look like them? And those are all important things. Those are, I'm not trying to diminish those.
Right.
But there's a whole set of other things that are happening at the identity level, at the family level, that are really substantial and like really costly and complicated and often require lots of conversations. And my hunch is that's not the kind of thing you have a conversation about once. That keeps coming up. So then it's, well, could you at least come to this one service because they're going to be doing the special thing for your cousin or whatever, and you're like, okay, sure, I guess I can do that. But it's because a lot of those things are mixed together. And then the community has to make sense of that. Are you voting no on us, all of us? What happened here? And
right. It's hard not to take those things personally.
Yes.
It's really hard not to be, because the concept of family and collectivism is so huge in certain cultures.
Yeah. And
it's just so different from kind of, American huge. Individualistic,
totally,
very independent thinking. And so it really messes with us who are
that's right.
Not raised in that.
And so much of that is that first, second culture thing,
right?
The generations. There's a lot you're processing to do that stuff, and then when you layer on top of that, now you're going to be a children's ministry director. Was that your first hire?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming, though I'm not sure, you're a pastor now.
Yes.
So, at what point did you become a pastor in that journey? How many years in?
I want to say the title change came maybe 5 years in.
Title change? I love that. Okay. So, yeah, no, I know. I mean, this is partly some of our vineyard stuff we're trying to sort out. Like, okay, so then one day they're like, now you're a pastor. You're like, really? Like, what changed? Anyway, but I assume that becomes complicated, even with your family. Like, we're not sure we do that or believe that. Right. But now our daughter is this, which again feels like a departure.
Yeah. We don't talk about it too much.
Here's the way we've managed that, Jay. We don't talk about that, which is Not all bad. I mean, if they're able to go along with it without entirely understanding it, that's okay. That's actually a form of kindness.
Yes. Yeah. So I think there are still obviously just questions on their part about,
Yes.
similar to the questions I had coming into the vineyard. Is this all okay?
Right.
Is this legit?
Yes.
But I believe that they have come around in certain aspects. That they'll come to our church every now and then.
Bless them.
Which is great. Yeah, it's still and it's in progress.
Of course.
My great hope is that everyone from my family will be at our church.
That's funny.
Big audacious hope.
Well, because I imagine, now I don't know this to be a fact, but just knowing churches that follow similar trends, I imagine that the Filipino Southern Baptist Church has gone through a few changes themselves as another generation raises up and is leading. That generally happens with immigrant churches. They have to go through a few iterations as another generation grows up. So it's there, that tension, and we talked about this at length in Dennis's podcast, and where the challenges are with Chinese immigrant churches and having a second generation. It's, some of it's language, but a lot of it's culture and how to navigate those processes. And so, I imagine that church is different too. So it would make sense that everyone's probably trying to figure out a new way forward, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting so my brother still attends with his wife and my parents, but the other two siblings and myself, we've found other places to worship. And so it's just interesting to notice and see what's changed. And I was actually speaking with someone who I went to youth group with yesterday about this, and just how this process is painful. It's just so painful, but it's necessary.
Sure. Yep.
For churches to continue.
Yep. It's messy.
And to continue. Yeah.
Yeah, that's messy. That's not straightforward. Those are messy, complicated, painful. Okay, but here you are now. You're a vineyard pastor. And so let's land like this. I would just love to hear you say what your experience has been like growing this. Of course, now we have Asian American Association. Talk through a bit of just your experience being in the vineyard, like watching, growing as a pastor and as a leader, and what your dreams are. You gave an incredible talk at the association meeting. I loved it. I've told you at least every time I've seen you, I've tried to tell you that, because I was very encouraged. Oh, truly, deeply encouraged by what you had to share and some of the ethnic opportunities and challenges coming from your background of learning to find your voice, but also just appreciating what had been given to you and what that offers to the vineyard. So without making you do your whole talk again, because you did say a lot of these things, say a little of what your experience has been like, how it's growing and changing, what you hope for, those things.
Sure. So I remember my first national vineyard conference was in Galveston.
Mm-hmm. I remember that
in
one.
2009, I want to say. And I had been relatively new to the vineyard at that point. But I remember walking in, and similarly to kind of like my college experience, feeling like, oh, okay, this is what it's like. And so again, kind of feeling like, do I even belong in this room where the people that might understand or look like me, or, not that it was an awful conference by any means, but it was just a part of it. It was something I noticed and recognized. And I think since then, there have been moments where that feeling returns. And so with the formation of the associations, I've just been so personally impacted by getting to know, by relationship with people who are in different parts of the vineyard. And I think I have more of an imagination for what's possible because of these associations. So I'm a part of the Asian American Pacific Islander Association and also the Women's Association.
Yeah.
And so it's just been, the last 2 years have just been so much fun and so personally encouraging, because now I have names and faces and friends who I can ask, what do you do? How do I do this as a woman? How do I think about this as an Asian American Pacific Islander? The Wellbeing of Pastors Initiative I'm a part of the first Asian American Pacific Islander cohort.
Yep.
And just that there are these safe spaces that they provide such, coaching and spiritual direction and a mentor and a cohort, that has just added so much encouragement and life to my ministry. I feel like there's more of just an actual tangible, like it's possible, and there's more of us, and we can keep moving forward. It's cut down on my loneliness, and in those spaces, it's provided just these means of conversations and experiences where I feel like I'm able to bring the fact that I'm an Asian American into the conversation, and that there's people that understand what that means. And then, so I feel like having been involved in those associations really helps me to do what I need to do in my local church. And it's given me that kind of encouragement and exhortation and just support to be able to continue. So I'm really hopeful for these associations. I'm really hopeful for the future. Just, rubbing shoulders against people who at the Asian American Pacific Islander Summit, I'm just realizing there's so much more of us than I thought.
Yep.
But it's amazing. And so we don't have to feel so alone, because we're not. And I think there are more of us that are able to do more than we think. Yeah. And I think that's a very Asian American Pacific Islander idea. Like I know, I'll speak for myself, the ways in which that I've been maybe brought up, or culturally, or whatever expectations, the ideas that we, can't speak up, as an immigrant, you need to just blend in. Some of those things don't serve us now. Like that, those things are really kind of have kept me from speaking up and maybe walking into everything God has called me to. And so I think that's a message that isn't even necessarily just for Asian American Pacific Islanders. There are people who in our movement just need to hear that whatever ways in which we've been brought up, or our experiences, how quickly we sometimes disqualify ourselves because of those things, that it doesn't need to be that way, that there's more. And so I'm just really excited for the work of the associations. I'm really excited for already the impact that it's had, not just on me personally, but I know speaking with others, it's a deeper level of coming home and feeling like we're home in the vineyard.
Yep. That's great. And I think that's what we're trying to do, obviously, but it's good to hear it said like, no, that's actually working. It's creating a context where people are more open and honest, able to experience healing. Because what's true is you came into the vineyard because for any number of reasons, the Holy Spirit was drawing you. Mm-hmm. You were having encounters with the Holy Spirit. You're sitting in the back weeping. You're in small group learning to hear God's voice, and you're praying for people, and you're doing all these things. And you're willing, just on the face of that, to make sacrifices to say, I think this is the church I'm going to be connected to. And you fight through a family meeting or two or some awkward things without knowing, there's going to be a way this is going to work, but just deciding, no, I think this is what's right for me and the way I'm growing in my life with God. But then also to be offered an opportunity to say, well, how does that blend together in the places where I don't know if I'm seen or heard or understood, or in the places where can I bring the whole of myself here? And I don't know how to bridge all those gaps. I love all of this. So I'm not demanding it all be different, but I'm wondering, how do I contribute and how do I connect to this? And to be able to create context where you're with a whole bunch of other people that have, in a sense, already all voted yes. They all have already voted yes on the vineyard. Like, this is my family. But then asking a second question, which is, and can I bring all of me to this? I haven't know that I figured that out.
Right.
And being able to have people that have similar stories say, there is this part that doesn't fit as well, or there is this component with my family that I'm not sure how to navigate, or even the ways that I've been really aware more recently talking with the Hispanic Association and then a bit with some of the folks in the Asian American Pacific Islander Association around how we understand marriage and family and raising kids and how that relates in a church. And so it's one thing if you're in like Dennis's church that's Chinese American all the way through. It's another thing if I'm a Chinese American in a predominantly white church, navigating some dynamics around marriage. Like I go to a marriage class and some of these values don't seem to fit. Is that a Christian value I have, or is that an ethnic value?
Right. Whose values are being centered in this situation, and would it even apply to most people in the room? Is I think because in our church context, we're very diverse.
Yes.
And so it's a lot of fun, but it also brings up a lot of these questions for me.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, because people come, and they don't know. You're not easily able to parse your own experiences as though, this is obviously just the way my family works, or this is obviously the way my ethnic background works, or, no, this isn't about either of those two things. This is about like the way Jesus wants us to be, or this is how my socioeconomic world works, or this is kind of uniquely vineyard versus maybe another kind of Christian thing I was raised in. Or so which of these things that I've just thought of as one thing, it's all glommed together, which is which? And especially if you marry across ethnicities, or even denominational worlds, or theological frameworks, or frankly sociological worlds. It's in marriage those things get really fleshed out, and if not as much in marriage, in parenting. Like our young girl needs to be raised like this. Well, wait a minute. Is that Is that because that's what God wants? Is that because that's just kind of how your culture has done it? Is that because your unique brand of Christianity wanted you to kiss dating goodbye? Or whatever, right? Like in which is which. Those aren't like super straightforward.
Nope.
But in these contexts, we can at least start to parse some of those things. Like we can start to parse out, no, this part does seem more ethnically or nationalistically wired in something, or this does seem tied to gender in an interesting way. And
right.
What do we think about that? Is that what we want, or
right?
What if that works and what doesn't work? That isn't just like instantly clear.
And how does it inform then?
Yes.
Our churches and how
Precisely.
we lead and how
That's
we
right.
call people to ministry.
Yeah, who we recruit, how we recruit them. But you
right.
have to have context where you can honestly talk with people that look and have similar experiences as you have.
Mm-hmm.
To where you can say, do you think this is like an Asian thing, or is this just a thing? Like, I don't know which one this is like. Though there might be some stereotypes, they're not always consistent.
Right.
But I've noticed, even as I'm watching folks in the Hispanic Association talk, like how the role of women is understood, and then going, okay, but wait a minute, that might be more Baptist Pentecostal from your backgrounds than so there's a certain kind of a brand of Hispanic Baptists that does things differently than even maybe other Baptists, or there's certain brand of Hispanic Pentecostals that do things, it's almost like a subset of Pentecostals more than a subset of Hispanic. Does that make sense?
Right.
And I've been in a few of these where I'm like, well, wait. So are you saying that that's Pentecostal? Or are you saying that that's, and they're like, I don't really know. And so then they can turn and look at some of their other Hispanic brothers and sisters and go, and they're like, no, actually, I think that's more just a Pentecostal thing you're talking about. Oh, well, that's interesting. So then what does that mean in how we lead or develop, or how you're a part of a larger family like the Vineyard?
Yes.
But those are hard conversations to get to if you can't sort of check your assumptions. You can't kind of turn to somebody and go, hey, what do you think about this? How does that fit for you? And having, oh, no, I don't think, or no, that's definitely a thing. And that operates out of even scholarship. Like that is not just reading books on, the Hispanic American experience. It's with humans. And to create those rooms is really, really helpful. And I've also been encouraged to see how many of our, white Anglo pastors and leaders are like, can I come to the association meeting? Can I sit in, or can I ask a question, or how can I be a part of, because, we have a certain population in our church, and I feel like there's a lot for me to learn. That's been super encouraging too, to watch those dialogues open up a little bit more as we learn to trust one another. And it's encouraging.
That is encouraging, because what they're saying is they want to become more proximate, right? They want to understand.
Yes.
And they want to learn.
Yes.
And I think that's beautiful. And that's honestly in my life, when I think about how do I even get along with this person?
Yeah.
I mean, if I've heard them say this about whatever,
right.
What has been the most godly thing to do is to just befriend them, to get to know them, to share stories.
Yep.
And I had one friend in college who I really had no idea. I don't think this is going to work out. Like she thinks way too differently about race than I do. Over the course of the 4 years, she comes home to New Jersey with me, and she ends up marching in a Filipino Day parade with me in my home city.
So cool.
And so it's how it, and maybe that's what these associations are doing. It's all of us getting more proximate with each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's a holy thing. I think that's what God is doing. And it is so, so encouraging.
Well, I'm really, really grateful for your leadership. And I don't know if that talk you did at that meeting is public anywhere. If it is, we'll try and stick a link in because I think people would love to hear it, or I'd love to hear it again. And it's so encouraging to hear your story because I think there's many people processing the kinds of things you've processed along the way, but many more that are going to. Mm-hmm. So instead of that being an accidental process, it'd be nice if it was an intentional process. And so as we're interacting with folks from different backgrounds, we at least have some kind of framework. Like,
right.
Yeah, my hunch is you're trying to process this thing here. How can I be helpful to you? Or what would be helpful to your family even in this conversation? Those are things pastors and leaders can do. I know, Tim Keller, people have joked Tim Keller's church was the largest Asian church in America for a long time. and I think it was. It maybe is. Anyway, but I remember talking to someone from Redemption, them saying that they had a series of dinners where they would host families of people that were joining their church. And they would tell their story and why they believe in sort of a multi-ethnic church and how they appreciate the history of the families that have brought their children into the life of their church. And it was really a way of them creating an honoring pathway for a mother, a father to ask questions, to connect to the pastors, and at least just make a little bridge that made it just that much easier for a parent to look at their kid and say, yeah, these are good people. I'm glad you're in this church. It is beautiful. But the only way that they learned how to do that was because they saw, man, there's a bunch of folks in our church that are trying to jump some hurdles that I bet we could make a little easier. We, from a leadership chair, could bridge a gap that would serve some of these folks that are landing in the life of our church and serve these families that are trying to figure out, is my kid being taken into something else? I found that really impressive, but that's the kind of thing you begin to create when you understand the challenges.
Right.
But you can't create those unless you know those challenges. So I'm hopeful that as we continue to learn and grow from one another, we're going to have new thoughts about leading, new questions we ask as we pastor and connect with one another, like, hey, what do you feel about this? Or what would be helpful to you in that? Because again, the vast majority of the folks we're talking about right now have already said yes to the vineyard. Now they're asking, is the whole of me welcome and present in this place? And as they can figure that out, they'll be able to help others. And we as leaders will know how to be helpful in that process and pastoring people too. So I'm grateful for you. You're like a forerunner helping lead the way for so many. So I'm really grateful, and I'm excited to see all that we become. I really am. I think we're on the early days of seeing some major changes that will reflect the kingdom, the ultimate vision, that revelation vision, I think.
Yes, pulling heaven downward.
Amen. Well,
it is
thank you for
exciting time.
It is. Well, I appreciate making so much time. I took more of your time than I said I would, but thanks for making time. No problem. And I'd love to come back and talk to you some more about how you got into the role you are and all that you're doing, because you're doing a lot of cool stuff too in your church, which you didn't even get to talk about, but some other time. And how you have 5 separate words in your name. I would love to hear more about too. So
sounds good.
The We Are Vineyard podcast is a production from the team at Vineyard USA. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here's a few ways you can help us. Leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Connect with us online for additional resources. Our website is vineyardusa.org, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at @VineyardUSA. Thanks for listening. See you next week.